In this presentation, we're going to look at the mechanics of moral action, what morals mean, why they're important, and give us an introduction to how we can know them, how we can understand them scientifically, if you like. Our objectives for the session is really to look at what morals are and all of these things that we pretty much take for granted. What we want to do is put a bit more rigour around how we understand these things. The first thing we need to start from is an inquiry that Aristotle went through, and that is to ask ourselves the question, what are we doing here? Why are we here? What do we really want out of, our existence, if you like? You're probably watching this presentation right now, and we could ask the question, why are you doing it? If you're in class, you'd be asking, why am I sitting in class? Well, if you think it through, you're not simply sitting here for the pure thrill of it. I suspect that there are a number of reasons that you're doing it. They tend to form a hierarchy. You're watching this class so that you can pass the unit, so that you can get your degree, so that you can get a good job or keep your existing one. Why do you go to work? So that you can get money. Why do you get money? So that you can live well. And why do you want to live well? It's ultimately because you want happiness. You want to be happy. Why do you want to be happy? Aristotle asked that question 2,500 years ago. He wasn't able to answer it because it seems that happiness is something fundamental. We don't want happiness for any other reason. We simply want it. Somehow, it's what we're here for. And basically everything that we do in life, every free decision that we make, is all aimed one way or another at our happiness. And you can give this some thought if you like. It's worth going through a couple of activities. What we look at, what we can find, what we see when we do that sort of analysis, what we did with sitting in class or watching a video, is that we do what we call immediate things for immediate ends, or proximate ends, close ends, for close purposes, for purposes that occur to us as important at the very moment. And so watching a video right now is what you have chosen to spend your time on. But you do that in order to achieve these more remote goals. And they're all operating one on top of the other, one behind the other, for some higher or highest ultimate goal, some ultimate end, to use more philosophical expression. We can say that the ultimate end is really the motivator of the entire activity. One way or another, you've thought through and decided that in order to be happy, you're going to enroll in the degree and pass the subjects, and here you are watching this video. And so it's the ultimate ends that are important. Again, using philosophical terminology, we can refer to ends as the final cause of why we do something, although we'll be discussing that another time. We've seen through this little experiment, this mental experiment, that our ultimate end is happiness. Now we can define what good and bad mean in that context. A thing is good if it fosters happiness, either proximately or ultimately. And so even something like going to the dentist may not seem very pleasant, but it achieves the good end of our happiness later on because we don't get toothaches and all the rest of it. This also explains why we use the word good in such a diverse array of applications. When you buy a washing machine or a dishwasher, you're buying white goods. White goods. even though these days most of them are made of stainless steel. If you're wanting something tasty on your sandwich, you might have some salami. In the delicatessen or that part of the supermarket, it's known as small goods. Goods still contributes to your happiness. And we talk about things being good or bad when we're able to walk down the street and have someone help us across the road. That's a good thing for somebody to do. It's a moral good. If you're walking down the street and somebody knocks you over the head and steals your money, that's evil. It's bad. It's the opposite of good. It doesn't make you happy. It might make the robber happy. A good is anything that fosters happiness. And morals, one way or another, are about choosing the good. From this, we can derive a fairly simple conclusion, set up in the logical form of a syllogism. Syllogism consists of three parts. Two premises. The first premise is goods make you happy. We've defined that. The second premise is that morals realize or make real good things. And from that we can conclude that morals make you happy. Most of the time we don't think along those terms. A lot of people think that somebody is moralizing. They're telling you to do or not to do something that you really prefer to do. And so morals are perceived in a rather negative light. We're studying professional ethics, or a particular aspect of professional ethics. Somehow the idea of dealing with a professional who is ethical has attractive connotations. Being ethical is considered to be a good thing. And it's curious because the connotations of those two words, morals and ethics, are opposite, even though fundamentally they're closely related. And as we can see here, morals make you happy. Living in a moral environment makes you happy. Living in a town where people don't regularly jump in your window and steal your goods or do violence to the people inside makes you happy, and so on. By and large, I think as we said in an earlier presentation, the principles for appropriate behaviour, which we call morals, are what are important when they're practiced by the people around you. Conversely, they're the self-limitation that we apply to ourselves in order to realise our good and the good of those about us. From this we can ask the question, how do we know what good and bad is in this terms of happiness? It comes down to this question of, can we really know what it is that we need to be happy? It turns out that sometimes we know how to foster our own happiness. I might know that going to university will foster my happiness because it's a very reliable way of getting a good job and so on. On other occasions, I might think that it's an attractive idea to rob a bank. That's got a high risk possibility of giving me happiness, I guess, to the extent that I'm not caught. But there's a fair probability it'll cause me to spend the rest of my life in prison, have a ruined life, and not really be as happy as I might be otherwise. And in little ways, we often are tempted to do things which appear attractive because we see some good as a result, maybe cheating one of our clients or cheating the boss or cheating our wife or whoever it is. But inevitably, all of those places, while they appear attractive and do realise particular immediate goods for us, they usually, just about always, harm somebody, either ourselves or others. And once that unhappiness is realised, it's not really achieving good at all. We also have to consider the interaction between our good or our happiness and the good of those around us, either the people that we are immediately in relationship with or the community in general. When we look at environmental concerns that right now are being very heavily promoted, we can see that it is really understood in terms of doing things today which are usually pretty uncomfortable, recycling our used bottles and cans and so on is a little bit uncomfortable. I guess we got used to it. But it's understood that it's going to contribute to the happiness of our children's generation or our children's children, or perhaps, if we believe some of the folks talking about climate change, people in 500 or 1,000 years' time. So this balance between the good of ourselves versus the good of those around us or the community in general is a tricky balance. When we're talking about the good of the community in general, we often use the expression common good. And so, do we know how to foster other people's happiness, the common good, if you like, in the most general terms? Again, sometimes. Unfortunately, sometimes we will even will their unhappiness. And for that matter, we sometimes will our own unhappiness as well. From this, we can ask the question, is it possible to know it even though we often make mistakes? Some people would say, well, because they're bank robbers. Obviously, the bank robber doesn't know what he's doing because he's, effectively putting himself into prison or giving himself a high likelihood of ending up that way. And so he doesn't know what's good for him, and the same thing could be said of the person mugging somebody or breaking in or whatever. However, in a community, especially in a civilized community, it's generally believed that most people, most of the time, at least know how to foster happiness, even if they decide not to do it. And the object of moral philosophy is to improve the reliability of our understanding and make less mistakes. We can apply that to anything, whether it's physics or chemistry or whatever. In the moral area, what we're looking for is a more robust way of being able to make decisions that do realise greatest happiness for all involved. To start to look at how we understand happiness, we can start to look at what people are about, what causes people joy, happiness, pleasure, whatnot. And to do that, we're going to rely on an Aristotelian principle. Aristotle suggested that happiness is the result of presenting our faculties with their proper objects. Other philosophers in the Aristotelian tradition suggested that not only do we present our faculties with their proper objects, but we also provide them with their proper objects in due proportion, in due circumstance, and for appropriate reasons. And so if I provide myself with the pleasure of driving a Ferrari, that is a good thing, so long as I don't steal the Ferrari in order to obtain it. So I've presented my taste for driving lovely motor cars with a very lovely motor car, but I've done it in the wrong way. It doesn't stop it from being a lovely motor car and the experience from being a lovely thing, and likewise due proportion as well. It's a lovely thing to have a nice glass of wine with dinner. It's probably a less desirable thing to have 5 bottles of lovely wine with dinner. Same wine, same essential possible goodness, but because I'm using it in an inappropriate way, even in the proper circumstance, it loses its goodness. Let's look at some of the human dimensions, if you like, of happiness. We can break that up into our various faculties. And we'll start with the faculty of taste, one of our senses. All of our senses we can do this with. So we could say that the object of taste is food and drink. And we can understand food and drink in a number of different ways. If it's truly food and drink, things that are becoming for us, not kerosene or something, it's going to make us healthy. Another aspect, completely different aspect of food and drink, is that it has just beautiful attraction. It might be lovely to look at, it might be lovely to smell, it might be presented in a very becoming way. It has beauty. When we move to other senses, other faculties of sense, we can look at the faculty of touch, being satisfied by something that looks good, feels good, and achieves the object of touch, say in the area of clothing or shelter, by being solid and warm in winter or maybe cool in summer. We do similar things with sight. Humans aren't limited to senses. The most delightful things that we can do don't necessarily relate to simple senses. If we were dogs and cats, that would be a different issue. It's no point in reading poetry to my dog, but for a human person to sit down in front of, say, the television, you are seeing things, you are hearing things, but it's really the story, the delight of the story. If it's a murder mystery or something, it's the challenge of solving the puzzle. If it's watching a documentary, it might be deepening your understanding. But in a sense of sitting passively, your senses are not actively engaged necessarily with beauty or taste or fine sounds. It's because it's actually feeding your intellect. And we tend to find ourselves more intrigued, if you like, more attracted ultimately to intellectual issues. That can be a number of different intellectual issues, things like politics and science and perhaps the literature. There's a beauty to it. There is a truth and a fallacy to it. There's no point in getting carried away reading a supposed science book and finding that it was written by some quack and it's not really true at all. The intellect is especially good at understanding what is good, which we'll call ethical, and what is true, well, it speaks for itself. And we can talk about beauty as presented to the intellect. And so we can interpret things in our mind as beautiful as well. But we tend to focus more on the good, the ethical or the moral, and the true versus false. We might define truth a bit later. Another faculty of the human person is the will. Another aspect of humanity, which is generally understood to be distinct from dogs and cats and gum trees and whatnot. Other living things don't have the freedom of will which comes from the advanced intellect, which is unique to humanity. The will we can define as that part of our mind that chooses the good. We chooses right action, as understood. So the bank robber uses his free will to rob banks. And you might say, well, that's a pretty stupid thing to do. But from the bank robber's point of view, it appears to be the best thing he can do at that particular time, because his thinking about it, his intellectual reasoning, tells him there's a good chance of success, relatively small amount of work, and a pretty good standard of living forever after, if I'm successful. And maybe his estimation of whether he's going to be successful or not may not be totally accurate, but at least at the time when he makes the decision to go and rob his bank, he is willing what he considers to be the best thing for him at that time. So the will is a curious faculty of the mind. It responds to what is presented to it, mainly through the intellect and often through the emotions or the passions. And so I might see some very attractive piece of food on somebody else's plate, and I might be attracted to it so much that I decide to take it from them when they're not looking. Children often do this with their brothers and sisters. And so they freely act, they freely will to choose something which is perhaps attractive or what have you. Is it necessarily a good thing to do? Well, that's what we're here to look at. Does it involve truth? Well, not necessarily. But the willing tends to be a faculty where we choose good as understood. And it's understood through the powers of the mind, through the senses, through memory, through the intellect, and so on. And they all combine together. When we look at the faculties, we can see that things like our faculty of taste and smell cause us to grow healthy and so on, and it grows the person. The sense of touch being satisfied by its highest object, warm, attractive clothing, a solid house and so on, protects the person. The will is curious because it brings us closer to perfection as persons, as good people. And when we look at the question of integrity, very, very important, because the will, if it reliably chooses what is consistently good for all involved, then we would say that person has integrity. They're all together. They act in a consistent way. They're not good some days and bad others. And so integrity comes as an action of the will. In fact, most moral acts have to do with the will. And it's got to do with a person who not only wills things, but wills them reliably in a good way. We'll say that person has integrity. Aristotle gave us the maxim, simple expression, that the greatest happiness resulted when the highest faculty is presented with its highest object. As we go through these, we can fairly easily get to the notion that for humans, the intellect and will are higher faculties than taste and touch. It's one of the reasons why we write books about heroes or heroes in war or whatever. It's because they are people who have chosen often to protect those they care for, maybe their country. And in order to do that, they endure situations where they have to live on very uncomfortable rations, so their taste is not satisfied. They have to live in very uncomfortable conditions, maybe living in trenches or what have you, with very uncomfortable clothes, so their faculty of touch is not satisfied, and so on. Their lower faculties are not satisfied. But we revere them as outstanding because they have been willing to choose the highest object for their highest faculties. That's worth giving some thought to because you'll be able to apply it to lots of situations and maybe lots of ethical questions. Okay. One way or another, there are things more attractive for human people than simply the, shall we say, the physical pleasures associated with the senses. When we look at moral systems, we've already looked at the sophists and the classical realists. One way of understanding the difference, the reliability between systems, of gauging and relating, comparing moral systems, is to ask the question, in this moral system, what is the greatest good? The classical expression for that is the summum bonum, the greatest good. We have noted that for Aristotle, the greatest happiness came when the highest faculty is presented with its highest object, and the greatest good in Aristotelian thought is happiness. We've already noted that intellect and will are the higher faculties that are unique to the humans, and the intellect and will respond, they understand truth and goodness. And so that means that for the human, unlike dogs and cats and gum trees, our happiness is related to truth and goodness more than to pleasures that we share with animals, simply sensual pleasures. Now, all of this depends on knowing our human nature. Are we dogs and cats or gum trees, or are we something different? One of the distinctive characteristics of the human person is that, well, we are thinking people. We have a higher level of intellect than dogs and cats and gum trees, and we have the faculty of free will. And so if we understand that, we understand that one other thing about human nature, Aristotle described human nature, or what it was to be human, when he said that humans are social creatures, social animals. Perhaps dogs and cats are social as well, especially dogs. They don't have intellect and will in the same sense that we have, the same level of development, as much as some environmentalists might be inclined to disagree. We have no evidence of that. But the social dimension of our nature, combined with our faculty of free will, means that in order to realize our social nature, we have to exercise our will in a particular way. Now, that exercise is very much the stuff, the matter of moral inquiry, moral philosophy, and therefore ethical inquiry. So the questions we really have in front of us are, what is our nature? And how can we know not only ourselves, our natures, but also know what is appropriate for us to, in order to realize our happiness and also the happiness of others. So we have these elements of ethical inquiry sort of standing out for us. Let's look at the components of happiness. There are internal components of happiness. Internal, I mean, right inside, not merely to do with our, organs or something, lungs or something. Internal components of happiness are our intellectual skills, our physical abilities, and our affective relationships. They are the things which we can say are within us, part of us, something that we kind of bring to the table when we experience our life. That can be contrasted to the external components of happiness. And when we were looking at things like warm clothes and pleasant food and so on, we're looking at physical goods, those things outside us, even if it is a washing machine. External things can also be the good actions of others. It's particularly important when we're social animals. And this is very easily seen in people's psychological dispositions. It is not hard to put people into a bit of a psychological tailspin by simply being unpleasant to them, because they become remarkably unhappy as a result, compared to maybe other forms of, say, physical deprivation. Someone can be poor, they can be hungry, and they can still be fairly happy. Sometimes even more happy than people that have got lots of physical things. But if you put them in a situation where they feel lonely, alienated, disliked, often that affects their happiness far, far more than physical deprivation. Let's do some summaries. We can say that happiness involves, or collect these ideas, happiness involves physical things, involves the actions of others, maybe even our own actions, and we can divide the actions, whether they're ours or other people's, into skilled actions relating to, giving us a pleasant life. If I have someone coming along using their skill as a plumber to fix my pipes, then I'm happier as a result of that person's skilled action. If I have a good circle of friends who I can rely on, and I feel affirmed by, and I can feel more secure in their company, those effective social relations also help my happiness. There have been different attempts to categorize those elements of happiness. Aristotle does a very good job, and he provides us with a hierarchy of goods. I think I've already hinted at them. They start with physical things, they lead up into intellectual things, and also relational things. And you can fill in the squares there yourselves. But they come down to these three areas largely. When we look at how ethics fits into this framework, we could conclude that ethics impacts on how things are made and supplied, because that influences our access, our enjoyment of physical things. It's also ethics also impacts on how services are delivered. And so if I deliver my services as a professional, as a financial advisor or an engineer or a medical doctor, it has the capacity to satisfy the needs for skilled social action that people have in others. I'm not going to fix my own teeth. I rely on my dentist. My dentist is probably not going to fix his own heart attack or broken leg. He's going to rely on a doctor. And so this social provision of the goods that we need through the skilled actions of others is a very important component of our happiness. And if done properly in a civilized community, we're able to have a far better life as a result. And finally, ethics impacts on good social relations, good social design, if you like. By good social design, I mean here a clear understanding of those principles for, social behaviour, whether they've got to do with manners at the dinner table or family relations or whatever they are. Ethics certainly has something to say about all of those, right down to whether or not it's a good thing to rob people's banks and so on. When we look at these different areas of human activity and how they bring about the happiness of others, what we can see is that what we call the social sciences or the applied sciences, we can fairly easily conclude that they all have ethical dimensions. For instance, the engineer is really applying the natural sciences in the areas of physics and chemistry and possibly geology and other things for the good of the community, maybe the good of his client if he's designing a building, the good of the community if he's designing a bridge or something. A lawyer is he has an ethical dimension because his work involves making decisions for those who come to him, who rely on his services, that are going to put them in a more just situation. And so social and applied sciences have ethical dimensions. When we look at those, I've already mentioned engineering and the law. and maybe medicine, but they include all areas of the social and applied sciences. And here are some of the applied sciences, the practical sciences as they can be called. Now you notice that I mention economics here. Financial advice is really an aspect of that. We could put finance in. Economics is probably the broader area of human activity that this relates to. And what we can see is that the areas of financial advice, say, financial is related to the social and applied sciences, and it has a natural ethical component, whereas pure physics, for example, or mathematics, in themselves, they don't have ethical components. Now, we can summarize to a certain extent and bring this together. We've been talking about happiness, we've been talking about goods and so on. We now draw that together because if we have a habit of action, okay, some regular thing that we've made a part of our normal behavior, we refer to that as a virtue. And we can distinguish the virtues into two different classes. Again, this is using a classification system that has been in use for a very long time. The virtues we often associate purely with the moral virtues, but it's also important to be aware that there is a second area of virtue as well, and that has to do with the skilled actions of others. By knowing how to play sport, play tennis, it leads to my happiness. When I have a bit of spare time, I can go and play tennis, and I'm happier for spending my Saturday afternoon in that activity. Likewise, the skills of an engineer bring me happiness if I'm asking him to design my new house, or if I know that it's a fine engineering feat, sort of locked up under the bonnet of my motor car, I'm happier because of the skill of the engineer. Now, we could add financial advice, financial planning, as the skills that one person can bring that cause the happiness of another. And so it is a virtue, naturally a virtue, but it's in the area of the intellectual virtues. They can be distinguished from the moral virtues. They are habitual choices, decisions of the will, if you like. The intellectual virtues tend to be more qualities of the intellect and the memory. I know how to play tennis because I have had lots of experience at playing tennis, and I've made some decisions about playing tennis. I might have watched videos on good tennis players, and I might have copied their actions, and so I've used my mind, my reason, to perfect my tennis playing. So I have these habits of the mind in the memory as well, because I can remember how I play and so on. So I use my memory and my intellect to help my tennis playing. When I'm using primarily my will to achieve happiness for myself and for others, usually that's in the realm of the moral virtues. Ultimately, a moral virtue can be understood as having the virtue of habitually and reliably choosing the good. The intellectual virtues aren't actually moral at all. I can be very good using an oxy welder, and that might be something which does good for people in a manufacturing shop. I can take my oxy welder on the weekends in the middle of the night, use it to cut holes in bank safes. I'm using the same intellectual virtue, but for a completely different moral objective. So they're not moral as such. The other curious thing about the intellectual virtues, say my tennis playing ability or my ability to give reliable financial advice, is that the fact that I choose to use it or not use it doesn't impact at all on me having that particular virtue. I might be a beautiful artist, very competent at painting beautiful portraits, but I might choose to paint an ugly portrait. Does that mean that I've lost the intellectual virtue of fine art? No. It simply means that I've chosen to use it in a different way. And it's the same with all the others. An engineer might be an absolutely splendid engineer, but he may have discovered that he makes more money by choosing not to spend as much time on his structural design or whatever other branch of engineering he's pursuing. And so he's sloppy with his structural design, except for his friends. And so every now and then he's able to turn out a wonderful design which is efficient and most satisfactory for the engineering purpose. And he'll do that, for the customers that he likes. But for the customers he doesn't like, he spends half the time and applies half the effort. It doesn't mean that he's not a good engineer. Well, in the intellectual sense of the virtue of engineering, he may be not a good engineer in the moral sense because he is not habitually choosing the good of his clients. Moral virtues only exist when they are always, or at least mostly exercised. And so, for instance, somebody who knows that the best way to tell a lie is to tell the truth 9 times out of 10, because if you are able to do that, or maybe 99 times out of 100, people get to think that you're a very honest person, and all the time you are saying honest things. It is with the express intention of being able to tell your lie in a situation and for an effect which will give you the greatest benefit and the greatest reliability of being believed. If you tell lies every day of the week from sun up to sundown, nobody's going to believe you, and so being a liar is not going to be very helpful to you. Whereas having a reputation for being an honest person, but in fact deep down intending to basically organise your own happiness at the expense of others through, the big lie that you tell from time to time, you're definitely not an honest person. And the same thing with other aspects of the moral virtues. And so somebody who mostly practices a moral virtue actually does not have it at all. That's a very important principle to give some thought to, and I invite you to give some thought to this in your own time. We've seen that a good brings happiness. We can look at it in terms of what it does for the person who is presented with those good things. Especially when we apply it, we can apply it to the senses, and we can see that our sense of smell or touch or sight or hearing are all improved by being in the presence of their highest objects. And so somebody who has an interest in music, especially a musician, and you see this with most musicians, but especially I think violinists. If you get somebody who's only just learning the violin, it's a bit scratchy. But the more they hear good violin playing, and especially when they contrast it with their own violin playing, over a period of time, their ear improves and their playing improves. And you see this especially in music, that somebody who listens to a lot of music ends up getting what we call a good ear. And what that means is that their ability to discern good quality from bad quality is perfected. The same thing with somebody who drinks a lot of good wine, maybe not all at once, but over a period of time, exposing your taste buds to the best wines available, you end up developing a sense for what is a good wine versus a poor one. And you find that with most areas. One of the reasons why a good violinist, will maybe decide to spend tens of thousands of dollars on their instrument. A learner on the violin may not even be able to hear the difference between a good violin and a bad violin, and they might be quite happy with something that's worth $50 or something from a discount store. And to them, they are as happy as they can be with their violin playing. But the more the violin player perfects their habit of violin playing, that intellectual virtue, the more perfect that virtue becomes and the more perfect they become. So goods bring happiness and perfect natures. Evils, which are pretty much the converse, they tend to distort and destroy natures. In terms of the senses, poisons, illness, leaking plumbing, they all make life less pleasant, possibly make life shorter and uncomfortable. They are evil things. But likewise, being presented with the evil actions, whether they're your own or others, diminishes the person. It diminishes the victim of unethical actions. But if you give some thought to it, it means that the unethical practitioner, whether it's the unethical or the bad violinist, making his scratchy noises and causing other people's ears to hurt, or the unethical engineer who is responsible for a bridge falling down and killing hundreds of people, or an unethical financial advisor who may grow wealthy at the expense of giving rash advice and causing the unhappiness of clients. Those people, one way or another, are less for it. They may be wealthier, but in terms of their experience of life, a little reflection suggests that they are worse for it. The movie, or in fact the story of Lord of the Rings, features a couple of seriously evil people. And I'm thinking especially of the character Saruman, the wizard, who started off, and this is more apparent in the book than the movie, as the greatest of the wizards, a leader among the community who had fine taste in beauty and goodness and truth, and through the course of making unethical decisions, lost his sense of himself, of beauty and goodness. And you find that kind of a transition commonly through literature. You tend to see it also in practice, the way that seriously criminal activities are often associated with very base lives. Not always, but often. And so people that steal for their living, organised crime or what have you, will tend to be also associated with activities that one way or another, in completely different areas to their theft, but the other aspects of their life tend to be very base, and so their family relations bring a lot of unhappiness, and even their sense of aesthetics will often decay as well. It's a strange curiosity of human nature. When we compare the intellectual virtues and the moral virtues, we can ask the question, is it bad not to use an intellectual virtue that you might have? I might be a wonderful tennis player. What happens if I choose to play work, not play so well. I might have my, young nephew who's just starting out and hardly know which end of the tennis racket to hold on to. And so I don't serve so hard and I don't return so aggressively so the little fella can have a bit of a chance. Does that mean I'm doing a bad thing by not playing the way that I'm able to? Well, in that case, it's fairly likely that you're not doing a bad thing. When is it good not to use an intellectual virtue? Well, I guess I've already explained that. There is an element, an aspect of intellectual virtues that do bring them into the moral arena, and that has to do with the manner of their application. And the example of giving your niece or nephew a more pleasant afternoon by playing lightly with him on the tennis court is probably a good example of this. And likewise, the welder in his choices to use his oxy set for robbing banks. Intellectual virtue that is being used for a evil moral end. Let's look at the moral virtues. We said that you have a moral virtue if you always practice it. So it's a habit. As a habit, it shapes your behavior. It becomes an aspect of your nature. It becomes something that you're known by as distinguishing characteristic. And it should be as evident as the colour of your hair, or maybe not colour of the hair anymore, but something else which is distinctive of you. A moral virtue always has to do with making decisions that realise the good, either for yourself or for others, and certainly not your good at the expense of others. And so it's a free, consistent inclination of the will, and that's probably a worthwhile definition to put down. It's a habit which is a free and consistent inclination of the will. In practice, it puts a bias, if you like, on our practical reckoning. I might be very good at driving very quickly because I'm a racing car driver. And so that gives me abilities that most people may not have. When it comes to making practical decisions, say driving from my home to the nearest shop or something, I purposely don't exercise my intellectual virtue of racing car driving, but that habit can give me an inclination, a bias in my practical reckoning. It means that if I do go driving, say on the weekend in the country or what have you, I might be a little bit safer, not necessarily because I'm going faster than everybody else, but because if something unfortunate happens, the tyre blows out, or you go around a corner and find someone lying on the on the road unconscious because they've fallen off their motorbike, a racing car driver might be able to drive around them rather than through them or over them, and so it realises a good outcome. When we talk about moral virtues, if I have the moral virtue of honesty, then that means that I'm biased towards honesty, even in situations where I'm tempted very strongly. I might have an opportunity where being a little tiny bit dishonest might make me a lot of money or bring me a lot of pleasure or fame or whatever it is that I'm looking for. But because I have this habit of truth-telling, I'm biased, I'm inclined to swing things in the practical order in a way which is also moral. It all means that if you have that moral virtue, simply or exclusively by the practice of customarily exercising it. And that's fine in the good times, but is really tested when you're inclined to do otherwise. such as the case where they're telling a lie to make a lot of money or something. If I tell the truth in all of those cases, except where it causes me considerable benefit, I'm a liar. I'm definitely not a truthful person if being tested means that I cave in. Perhaps under extraordinary pressure or something, we might have to make exceptions, but in general, that is the case. But in extraordinary circumstances, if someone's holding a gun to my head, well, I may not be acting freely, and so that might be a counter example. But if in normal situations where I'm given the opportunity of free action, then the moral virtue comes through its customary exercise. And by that customary exercise, like other things, I'm a different person once I develop some virtue. I think I'm a different person as a result of learning how to ride a bicycle. That's a habit that is now a reflex virtue. I don't even think about how I ride a bicycle. But as a result, I'm better off for it. I'm a better person, more capable person, if I have the intellectual virtue of being a good cook. It makes me into something a little tiny bit different. It alters my nature because my mind is altered. I have a capacity I didn't have before. I am more perfect. Now, while we're talking about perfection, by the way, and often people get very sensitive about this word perfection. When I use the word perfection here, I'm using it in the philosophical sense, which is a little bit different to its common use. If you see somebody who's all the time talking about how excellent they are and how they do everything bigger and better than everybody else, that kind of perfection, you look at it and say, oh, I don't know if that perfection is very attractive. That sense of perfection can be rather tiresome. But a perfection philosophically is meaning merely a something which is the best it can be, not necessarily in a vain, definitely not in a vain sense, because vanity is anything but a perfection. But the moral and intellectual virtues make the person more social, especially the moral virtues. The intellectual virtues help the social nature of humans by enabling them to be able to contribute more to the happiness of others. The moral virtues even more so because they make the person more trustworthy. And if you give a bit of thought to it, society is all about trust. You can't have a real society of robbers and liars. One of the things that I always find a little bit intriguing is the story of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. Aladdin's Cave and all of that. And the puzzle there is how does Ali Baba keep his 40 thieves? Because if they're seriously bad men, wouldn't they be spending most of their spare time conniving to steal from each other and do other hideous things to each other? And so there's this puzzle, because ultimately a thoroughly bad person is going to be thoroughly unsocial or antisocial or countersocial, going to be sort of socially repugnant. The trick in being effective as an immoral person is to be mainly sociable, and so people sort of not only put up with you but enjoy your company, while being able to secretly do these antisocial things which are moral evils. We've already seen that to be moral is to reliably decide the good, and it's usually social. We've explained perfection. Now, again, we're using philosophical terms here. The form is the design, the that design, it's probably more than shape, which the thing has the capacity to be. For example, very often we encounter things which are not as perfect as we would like them to be. I once enjoyed riding motorcycles very much. And the word motorcycle, the concept of motorcycle, the thing which is a motorcycle is a motorized two-wheeled vehicle. And when you get onto a motorbike, you're wanting something preferably that will do what a motorbike does, which is to transport you. And to do that, the most exciting way to be transported is to have lots of acceleration, lots of power, and lots of good handling. Now, in that way, we can understand that the perfect motorcycle is something which is extremely powerful, wonderfully good handling, very comfortable, nothing worse than sitting on an uncomfortable bike for 2 hours, and so on. And so we can understand when we think of motorbike, we think, well, what are we doing? The Yamaha Motorcycle Company or the Honda Motorcycle Company, every year they try and make their motorcycles a little bit better. What are they trying to do? They're trying to bring the actual motorcycles they build to the perfection that conceptually the community, and especially the design and engineering and so on, think is possible. And they do that by getting it closer to its form. What is the ideal motorcycle? What is the essence, the perfection of the form of being a motorcycle? That's one which is super fast and extraordinarily around corners. And year by year, that's being kind of attempted to realise. And so our moral decisions and so on bring us closer to the perfection of what it is to be human. Like turning last year's Yamaha into next year's Yamaha by making it go around corners a little bit faster, or being a little bit more fuel efficient, or a little bit more comfortable, or whatever it is. To perfect a thing is to bring it closer to its form. In the human area, when we're talking about the highest ends of the human person being social, then the more perfect we're becoming, the more moral we're becoming, the more social we're becoming. And so we're perfecting ourselves. And from that, we can draw a very simple and very powerful definition. A moral is a principle for the appropriate relations between intelligent persons. Very useful to learn that principle. A moral is a principle for appropriate relations between intelligent persons. It infers that we treat other people as intelligent persons. Other Homo sapiens have, if you like, the same dignity, the same rights as we do. And moral philosophy is about working out those principles that we can, then live by ourselves and hopefully our whole community, which will cause the greatest happiness. From that, defining ethics is fairly easy, because an ethic is no more than a set of morals. We've already noticed the way that ethics has a more positive connotation than morals. That seems to be just an accident of our time and culture. When we study ethics, professional ethics or other ethics, what we're doing is studying particular sets of morals. And so if we're going to study and really master a set of ethics and be able to comment on how that the value, the goodness of that ethic, that set is, and maybe contribute to its improvement over time, then that's really probably the object of the moral endeavour, and it's really about the moral dimension, those individual principles, and that's what we're trying to get a better understanding of in moral philosophy. We're now going to look at the question of the different types of morals, or at least moral investigation. And we're going to do that by distinguishing between two aspects of the moral problem, if you like, or our moral life. We're going to call those pure and practical morals, pure and practical moral issues. Pure moral thought is concerned with the goodness of particular activities. So it's the activities in themselves, the principles, which we saw in our definition. By contrast, practical moral thought is applying pure moral thought to practical situations. It's what happens when you go from the ideal to the concrete, if you like. It doesn't mean that the rules change. It just means that there are situations where you can't simply apply every moral principle, every principle for appropriate relations that you might have in your little bag of tricks. And so we need to know how to apply the principles in practical situations. And we find that very often. You can see it very much in the code of ethics for professionals. In our case, the current code for financial advisors. So it's the application of the principles to practical situations. It doesn't change the pure moral principles, but it does moderate their application. So what we can say is that some pure moral principles relate to how to apply moral principles to practical situations. I think that really should read some moral principles do relate to how to apply them. So we have principles for the principles, if you like. Let's look at a pure moral question. Truth-telling. Whether or not telling the truth, some people believe that it's simply a cultural or social convention. We'll explore the question of truth-telling in a separate presentation. But for now, we can investigate it as a pure moral question. I want to tell a lie. Lying is immoral. Is moral. Is lying immoral? Okay, is it something which is merely a convention, right? Let's analyse that. What is communication? Communication is the transfer of an idea, a concept, if you like, from one human mind to another. I'm speaking to you right now. I'm conveying concepts which are in my mind, or maybe on my PowerPoint slides, to your mind. If I convey the concepts in my mind which I know to equate with reality, let's say my memory of Plato's writing. I've told you that for Aristotle, the greatest good was happiness. Okay, I know that. I've read it. Aristotle may or may not be right, but I have read that Aristotle said X, Y, Z. And I say to you, Aristotle says X, Y, Z. There is a conformity now in what's inside my mind, the statement, the concept, the proposition that Aristotle said happiness comes from presenting the highest faculty with its highest good and so on, or any one of those Aristotelian expressions. And now you've learnt those things, and so now you have the same concepts in your mind. I'm stressing this because I want you to give some thought to the way that the honesty there is not a function of the situation or what have you. The pure validity of the communication is something which is outside the circumstance. But if I tell you that Aristotle said that pigs might fly, I would be saying something to you, giving you an idea or a concept in your mind which would be different to the concept in my mind. I can utter those words, but I can't believe that Aristotle said pigs can fly. And so I'm creating a disproportion between the concepts in your mind and the concepts in my mind. So far, so good. I mean, that in a sense is a very complicated and tedious way of explaining what telling a lie is. Why is it important? Because if you started our exchange as equal to me, equal in dignity as a human person, and even though your mind may not have been very familiar with Aristotle, I've come along and told you that Aristotle says that pigs can fly. Now you go off and live your life with that concept in your mind, and you might find yourself in some situation, a party or a bar or something, and say, oh, I'm really enjoying this ethics stuff. Did you know that Aristotle said that pigs can fly? And people start to laugh at you, and you're humiliated, and you're upset, and you're unhappy. Okay? Because of the disproportion that I have created, willingly created, I have decided consciously to tell you something which I know to be untrue. I have created a disproportion, an inequality. And so the ideas there, at least with respect to what you understand of Aristotle and what I understand about Aristotle, I've created that, I've consciously created that disproportion. I've made you less than me. And since you are equal to me, by causing you to be less than me, I have robbed you of something. Now, it's not necessarily something which is simply culturally specific. There may be cultures on Earth somewhere that consider fibbing to each other to be reasonable, but there aren't very many. And generally the only time when that sort of thing is tolerated, even in those cultures which are bizarre enough to consider lying under certain circumstances to be reasonable, it tends to be lying between the insiders and the outsiders. And you can see this with cannibalism, that some societies consider it reasonable to eat people. But we look in from the outside and we can see the cannibals, well, historically, say in New Guinea or Fiji or somewhere, Maori in New Zealand, and say, yeah, they eat other people. However, from the Maori point of view or the New Guinean point of view or the Fijians' point of view, they're not actually eating people, because they're eating people that aren't part of their tribe, and therefore they don't really have the same human dignity. Their anthropology is different. And so they start off from a position where they don't think that other people are equal to them, so it doesn't matter if you eat them or not. But within their tribe, they would fiercely defend honesty. You can maybe have a serious look around to see if you can find an example of where that doesn't happen, but I think you'll find it very rare to find an actual case, despite it being a popular myth in our culture. We've already noted the way that we're violating our essential inequality. It's curious to see, because what that does is that it makes something like lying almost a mathematical issue. Certainly it has that same kind of existence, that mathematics doesn't exist in a material order. You don't see 2. You certainly don't see 2 plus 2. You might see 2 eggs or 2 pens or 2 motor cars driving down the road, but you don't see 2. Likewise, you don't see the equality between 2 things. You might observe them to be equal, but their essential equality, especially when you're dealing with the equality of their minds, is something a little bit more immaterial, intangible. But being intangible doesn't mean it is not real. And from our discussion here of truth-telling, we can see that inequality, if you had a calculator that said 2 equals 3 or 3 times 2 equals 5, you'd throw that calculator out because it doesn't compute properly. And this is pretty much what we're seeing here. And on that basis, the failure of the proportion means that the principle involved is not a good principle. And that is quite independent of the desirability of the effects. I might make a lot of money by lying. However, if I did, that doesn't change the fact that I'm a liar. The fact that I might be very wealthy as somebody who's been ripping somebody else off doesn't change the facts. Okay, let's look now at practical moral determinations. Practical morals is the application of moral principles, appropriate relations between persons, to practical situations. We're going to use the example of punctuality. Let's imagine you and I had had decided to meet at a particular time, and for whatever reason, I might be out mowing the grass or working in the gym or something, and I'm spent a little bit of time in the gym, a little bit too much time, so I look at my watch and think, my goodness, I'm going to be running late here. I would really like to have a shower and change my clothes, but if I do that, I'm going to be late. That wouldn't respect the person I'm going to see. Conversely, you can say, well, I don't want to be late, and so I'll just sort of not have the shower. Or on the other hand, I might say, well, I don't want to, offend this person's nostrils or something, and I say, well, I'm going to be half an hour late because I'm going to have a nice shower and maybe go down the barber and trim myself up and all the rest of it. Because after all, good grooming is a way to show respect to others. The problem is that the situation will not allow both. What do? Now, we're not saying that punctuality is not a good thing. We're not saying that good grooming is not a good thing. They're both, in a sense, purely speaking, virtuous. Showing somebody respect by punctuality is a good thing. It's a virtue. And the same. What I have to do is make this decision. And that leads us to the contingent moral virtue of prudence. And we said that some moral principles have to do with the ordering of other moral principles, and prudence is one of the principal examples of that. Prudence is the skill to determine how to apply moral virtues. Now, we've talked a bit about human nature, or natures in general, the idea of perfecting human natures and so on. We'll just put these together as a summary, if you like. We can observe that humans are rational animals. We've spoken about that before. We're also physical, so we have physical needs. We have reason and will and so on. And we're persons with dignity. That, in a sense, gives us objective elements that we can use to make objective conclusions about both pure and practical moral questions, moral principles. Humans are also social. They realise themselves through their relationships. And the curious thing about humans is that we are attracted to what we call the transcendentals. Now, I've already been using some of these in earlier slides. There are three things which it is understood, Aristotle understood, were pretty much inevitable for humans to be attracted to. And they are things which, in a sense, aren't concrete, aren't physical, but you see them in the world around you and perhaps the actions of what happens around you. The three transcendentals are truth, beauty, and goodness. Three things that humans are inevitably attracted to. Humans have happiness as their final end, as their ultimate goal, if you like. And finally, humans make mistakes sometimes. We mix up our final ends. We might think it's a good idea to have a shower after being at the gym, but the person that you're meeting, has got a really urgent timetable, and so they prefer you to turn up, dressed in sort of smelly t-shirt and with a towel around your head, as long as you turned up there on time. We make mistakes. We make more serious mistakes when we choose to violate more apparent and more important moral virtues as well. But that's pretty much the stuff we're working for. And so understanding the human person, the other thing about what we see on this slide is that these are things that we can know objectively. They're not simply a matter of our feelings or inclinations. These are things which are, you can conclude about human nature regardless of whether it's you, me, or somebody else doing the observation. And they lead to conclusions, to principles that likewise are either realised or violated by particular individuals or societies and so on. We've already noted that other humans have equal and unique dignity to the acting subject. This is important. And the other elements that make up their nature. This has actually troubled thinkers, on and off different times in history. What happens when people are asleep? Do they have the same dignity? Well, since people are potentially, have the capacities that they do, even if somebody not only is asleep but has been, a victim of a car accident or what have you, where they have a bit of brain damage, because they are potentially humans, either through the fact that they're not conscious at the moment or because of some other incapacity, then that doesn't diminish from their value, their merit, the equality with other humans on the planet. And so they warrant equal respect and the opportunity for happiness. And especially their dignity is not due to their usefulness to us. It is due, if you like, to their DNA, something which is in them, not in us. And that's very, very important, because there's a tendency when inclined to do things which we might call immoral, unethical, to really do it because we don't consider other people as valuable, as worth respecting, merely because they're not useful to us. They won't earn us a quid or something. And you see this with relatives who want the plug pulled on very sick or elderly relatives. Get rid of them so we can get the inheritance, that sort of stuff. Interesting question for estate planning. Because to do less, to fail to respect their human equality is to deny their nature relative to the active subject. Active subject is a fancy way of saying me when I'm considering some action. And to deny their nature relative to me as the acting subject, it would simply be to live an untruth, to act out an untruth. For an intelligent person, to live an untruth is to live below one's own dignity. I am an intelligent person. I understand truth and untruth. And so to live an untruth is really, apart from the harm that it causes others, it is also, in a sense, a way of belittling oneself. It goes back to Saruman in Lord of the Rings. Again, in the book, it sort of drew out probably more powerfully than in the movie, that Saruman, before he turned over to the dark side, his whole estate was one beautiful garden. But as he got involved in the orcs and the evil plans of Sauron and all that, he ended up chopping down all of his trees and using them to fuel his furnaces, and they were filthy, ugly things doing filthy, ugly work. And in the end, his garden was turned into something which was, visually and, to all the senses, totally repugnant. And it was meant as a metaphor to the way that when we live immorally, we live an untruth. It is to live below one's own dignity, and in a sense, it is to dehumanize ourselves. And so from all this, it's fairly easy, I think, to conclude what Aristotle got to at the end of his fundamental ethical or moral inquiry, and that is that our objective, the objective of the exercise of our will, is to do good and, of course, to avoid evil. Avoiding evil means both not to perform evil ourselves and also to keep away from the evil actions either of other people or other actions in our environment. I mean, obviously, going for a picnic sort of in the shadow of a volcano as it's about to erupt, it's a good idea to keep away from that. So you avoid the physical evil, if you like, of the volcano, or maybe sitting on the freeway or something, a physical evil. So the aim is to do good, do things which perfect your own nature, realize the happiness of yourself and others, whether that's personal happiness or the common good, the happiness of the community and so on. So let's look at some implications of respecting the dignity of others. First of all, we've talked about telling the truth, communicating truth or nothing. Again, we will take this in a separate presentation, because we'll use a separate presentation just to explore the way that truth-telling is actually an objective moral principle. It's not something which is socially or personally decided on. So communicating truth, also acknowledging social location, treating people with respect due to their station is important. That doesn't mean that you kick people because they have a lowly job, but it certainly means that the dignity which is due to somebody who happens to occupy a position of importance is important. Acknowledging social location can be realised also in submitting to just authority. If a policeman tells you to do something, well, it's a good idea to do it. Courtesy and good manners is all built out of acknowledging social location. Refraining from violence against innocent persons is an implication of respecting the dignity of others. Obviously, if you kill somebody, you're not treating them as your equal. Respecting other people's property, and that includes property in themselves, but also property manifest through exchange. So somebody's land property or their stock holdings or what have you. Respecting other people's property is very important. These are all, if you like, direct moral principles that make up or can be constructed into an ethic. We can also look at those that follow on, if you like. We'll call those contingent moral acts. Contingent means to be the result of something, to follow on. Because some acts don't appear to be moral in themselves. Sitting down. Is that moral or immoral? Well, it's just sitting down or walking down the street or blowing your nose or anyone, a number of things, simple actions. However, some actions, while they're not in themselves moral, and this only holds, by the way, for actions that aren't in themselves moral, can become moral. If you're in a courtroom or a lecture, sitting down might be very appropriate when you're being told to by the judge. It could be immoral if you remain seated while the judge is entering or leaving the courtroom, and similar in other places. And it also becomes immoral if in the act of sitting you're causing harm to others, some moral harm to others. And so we can see that some acts draw their moral value from their ends, from their objectives, from what the outcome of the act is. I mentioned this is not always the case, but it does mean that intention becomes an important dimension. So understanding moral situations or interpreting moral dilemmas means that you have to take into account intention. Now this is important. There's an important distinction here though. We're talking about acts here that are in themselves amoral. In other words, they don't have a moral value. And so at best, and in fact usually, they draw their moral value from their ends, from the purpose that they're performed for, but also because of their impact on a social situation. Things which are in themselves have moral value, say telling the truth, they do not draw their moral value from their ends. So telling a lie is a lie, regardless of whether it's going to make you a lot of money or cause some other apparent good. Something which is naturally moral or immoral doesn't lose its moral value as a result of circumstance. Let's draw some conclusions on morals. We've seen that morals are about realizing happiness. The virtues realize intellectual moral goods. Moral virtues are habits, mostly for the good of others. Some moral principles come from human nature, and some things get their moral value from their purpose. We've distinguished pure and practical moral reasoning. Pure moral reasoning concerns the nature of moral acts, their objective goodness, whereas practical moral thought concerns prudence in applying the moral principles. Generally, we've seen that your aim is to do good and avoid evil. Doing good means that and avoiding evil, especially the second part, means that you cannot do evil so that good may come of it, because the evil is always an evil. With that in mind, we'll finish this presentation and we'll move on now to see how these principles are applied in the different moral systems that we can consider.